Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, November 7th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about my election prediction. I was wrong. My election prediction for the 2024 election inaccurately predicted that Vice President Harris would win the presidential election against former President and now President-elect Donald Trump. And I want to talk to you today about why my prediction was inaccurate, and first apologize for the fact that my prediction for the entire duration of the campaign period was very much under this assumption that this election was seemingly winnable by Vice President Harris. Now, I want to talk further about a lot of the data points that led me to my conclusion. Obviously, I really do want to take responsibility. A lot of you guys trust the data that I talk about and I put out and I cover. And for a while, too, I did very much believe that this election was going to go the direction at which I predicted it. Throughout the entire duration of the campaign period, there was never a moment in time where I felt I was inflating the odds or likelihoods of either candidate at winning. And I will say, over the past 3 weeks, this campaign period has seen a lot of ups and downs on both sides of the aisle. It is clear that on Election Day, Donald Trump had the upper hand and that many undecideds broke in his favor. And many of the polls were, in fact, correct for the first time in a long time with Donald Trump on the ballot. The first time I'd even say, arguably on the ballot, that Donald Trump was on, where we have seen accurate data points come up with near perfect results on Election Day. But I have to take responsibility. The data that I was putting out, the maps I was putting out, the predictions I was putting out, I do apologize if I was misleading you. And because I was misleading you, because clearly Kamala Harris had not won this election and was not going to win this election. So in terms of how we move forward and how we rebuild our understanding of electoral politics, this election has also broken a lot of what we've come to understand about the American electorate over the past 6 years. Since I started this channel, the American electorate has largely voted very similarly down different ideological backgrounds. Whether it's conservatives, liberals, independents, we rarely saw deviation in terms of support. And while we didn't necessarily see deviation on the front of ideological diversity, diversity in terms of race, education, financial background, all of these things really swung in different directions and largely in favor of the Republican Party in ways that arguably were very difficult to see from the very beginning. And I will say, part of my job here is to understand these trends and to show them to you. And I do believe, again, I really want to be honest in this, I do believe that every prediction I made, every video I made was rooted in the truth to what I believe to be the facts of the matter in that election. Coming off the 2022 midterms, I was also wrong in those midterm elections. I far overestimated Republican support, and I really was at a position where, come the next election cycle, I also on the back end was worried that I was overestimating Republican support once again. And so I tried to, keep that in mind as I was making my videos, making my election prediction, and I don't think that I felt like I was overestimating Donald Trump's support in 2024. I knew the race would be close. I emphasized that multiple times, that I felt like this was a 50-50 toss-up, but that Kamala Harris would have the upper hand. It is clear she did not have the upper hand. But I will say, predicting election after election, it has really come to be difficult to understand more and more about individualized trends, which is why I think this election shows that nothing is consistent in American politics in a way that makes it easy to predict elections. That's why it's really difficult, and many prediction sites, including forecasting sites, very reputable sources, where you have teams of 20 to 30 working on a forecasting model, ended up being inaccurate as well, because elections like these are sometimes hard to predict. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no merit in discussing the polls and the preliminary sources. Before we get more into why I was wrong, I do think that there is absolutely value in a lot of the data that we do comprehend. And the results that we predict from that data also can be correct. After all, and as I said earlier on, the polls I do think were largely right. You can see that in the models here. In terms of what the polls had predicted who was going to win each state, the polls only predicted 3 states incorrectly. Back in 2016 and arguably even in 2020, you were seeing it on par in 2020 when the polls were predicting that Biden would win Iowa and Ohio, and he didn't win either of those 2 states, or in some cases that he would win North Carolina and Florida, and he didn't win either of those 2 states. But it was really only this cycle that polls actually had the least levels of inaccuracies, but still predicted that Kamala Harris would be the president. And so that's something we need to really unpack moving forward. But I do want to say, I want to show you the results here in comparison to what my electoral map had predicted, because the rightward shift is something that cannot be understated. I do want to preface by saying that not every single state has finished counting their ballots, but I think this will go to show exactly where we missed our mark here and where in future predictions and in future videos we can discuss how do we account for this so that we aren't overestimating the support for Democrats, and in some cases we aren't overestimating the support for any other side of the aisle. Not necessarily Republicans, but think about things like Dan Osborne in the Senate race. That's a map where I did expect Deb Fischer to win, but we saw that she did slightly better than what the polls were predicting, given that that Dan Osborne was in a neck and neck race, ended up being roughly a 7 to 8 point race. But getting to my prediction map versus what we actually saw, my final map gave Kamala Harris 292 electoral votes and Donald Trump 246. I've seen a lot of comments discussing my map here and the inaccuracies of it, and plainly put, it was wrong. Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania and Nevada all were incorrect in Georgia. 5 states. Now, that's a lot. That is a lot of states to get wrong, and arguably, this is a map that even in 2020, when I was predicting that map, it was a lot more accurate. And I think a big reason for that is because of a number of factors that we'll discuss later down the line. But I do want to say, apologize for the 5 states being wrong. And looking at the battlegrounds, I really did believe that on Election Day, these races were toss-ups and that Kamala Harris had the upper hand. She did not have the upper hand, and we'll look at that on the actual map here. So this is the difference between what the prediction map said and what the actual map said. I actually do think there isn't as much of a change when it comes down to some of the red states. I do think that, Montana, Missouri, Indiana, South Carolina, we were all under this assumption on my end that these states would be Republican because they're certainly Republican, but that Donald Trump would be losing some levels of support. And that's because consistently throughout the Great Plains states, we believed that support would be minimized from 2020 slightly, not substantial. I said it in the final video that I expected these states to be 13, 14-point margins. They ended up being slightly over 15%. When it comes down to the swing states, though, you can see that's where the major swing happens. In terms of what my prediction was off by and the polling inaccuracies, they pretty much inaccurately predicted in all 7 battleground states that Donald Trump would perform about 1 to 2 to 3 points worse than what he actually got in those states. Now, I do say, and I do see that on the map here, on my prediction map, Arizona and North Carolina, I did think Donald Trump was going to win. And that was what my final map had said, that Donald Trump would be the favorite, that he would have a likely victory in Florida. Texas actually should have been a lead state here. I apologize for that. But Florida should have been a likely red state. Ohio was going to be likely red. And I did get Iowa and Texas wrong, and that I overestimated the amount of support that Kamala Harris would win. But in Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, those are particular states that I take interest in because I think Michigan was more off than those states because it was a lean blue state. But tilt blue states are states that I characterize when I believe a candidate is going to win the state by less than 1%. And so when I'm looking at the map here, and I'm looking at states that reasonably could have gone to Donald Trump, it wasn't necessarily shocking that Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Nevada went to Donald Trump. Michigan was more of a surprise. But these states were, in what I had thought the race would look like, were going to be the closest and going to be those states that could have swung either way, depending on what happened in the final stage of the campaign season. So I want to start off by saying the polls I was working with gave a reasonable margin of error that ended up being exhibited on Election Day. Like I said, the difference in the map here actually does translate to just minor improvements for Donald Trump relative to what the polls had said. For instance, a good example is North Carolina, where the polls had accurately predicted that Donald Trump was leading in this state by roughly 1 point. In Georgia, Donald Trump was leading by roughly 1 point. In Nevada, Donald Trump was leading by roughly half a point. In Arizona, Donald Trump was leading by 2 points. It was reasonable to conclude that Donald Trump was winning in these states, and I went against the grain for reasons that we can talk about later down the line. John Ralston in Nevada, misleading early vote reports in Georgia, and Election Day reports, because I made the video on Election Day, that ended up with me making Georgia and Nevada states that were against what the polls had predicted. And looking at Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, again, back to that point about being within that margin of error. Michigan, Kamala Harris was only up by 1 point on Election Day. Back in 2020, Joe Biden led by roughly 1 point. And so that matters, right? 7 points, 9 points, 8 points. I'm completely jumping all over the map here. But Michigan, a 1 point lead for Kamala Harris. Wisconsin, a 1 point lead for Kamala Harris. Pennsylvania, a 0.2% lead for Kamala Harris. The polls here, many of them, had the margin of errors that were extended beyond 3.5%. But the average for any high-quality poll is a 3.5% margin of error, meaning that Kamala Harris could have won the state by 3.7%, or Donald Trump could have won the state by 3.5%. And we ended up with something roughly similar on Election Day when it comes down to these battleground states. And you can see it. Wisconsin was a close state. Donald Trump won it by less than a point. Michigan, he won by 1.5%. Pennsylvania, he won by roughly a point. The margins here were very close to what the polls had predicted. They just ultimately were wrong in predicting who would win each battleground state. And again, I take responsibility for having contributed to this false narrative that Kamala Harris was winning these late decideds. I was looking at data points that we had seen, many on the left and on the right, that were making warning signs out there for Donald Trump. You saw it on Election Day, if you remember, how Charlie Kirk, And many members of the Republican strategy team were tweeting out, trying to encourage more people to vote. Donald Trump was calling into radio shows because his early voting numbers and the election day turnout numbers, in theory, did not look good for the former president. But we far overestimated the amount of support the Democrats were going to receive in some of these key and crucial areas. That's why states like New York and New Jersey have narrowed down in ways that we simply did not expect. Now, Kamala Harris, I will say, did not invest money outside of the 7 battleground states, and that's actually where we saw some of the most minimal slippage for the Kamala Harris campaign across the board. What I'm reminded of the 2020 election in comparison to this one is that Joe Biden invested tens of millions of dollars across states like Colorado and New Mexico and Minnesota and Virginia and New Hampshire and Maine. The Kamala Harris campaign did not do that this cycle. A big reason, they were focused on the core 7. And again, that's where we saw the most minimal slipping across the nation. But there's no denying it. Every single state swung to the right. And a lot of what was informing this decision around Kamala Harris was the final 2 weeks of the campaign season, where it arguably is very hard to know whether this is noise or just real indicators of what the election might look like. If you remember my video roughly 2 weeks before the election, I said Donald Trump was going to win the election. His pathway was through the Rust Belt in the Sun Belt. And although that ended up being the reality on the final map, I'm not going to claim that I predicted the election correctly, because I didn't. But I will say, in that final month, it was much more of a toss-up in my eyes than it was before, where Donald Trump was getting closer to victory, but Kamala Harris, by Election Day, still had that edge. And when you were looking at the very real data points, high-quality data points coming out of some states, I never believed that Kamala Harris was going to win the state of Iowa. But looking at the Ann-Seltzer poll, which had not been wrong since 2008, I did think might have been a small indicator that there have been some shifts in the Midwestern region in favor of Kamala Harris. When the gold standard poll came out of Kansas, that said that Kansas was going to narrow down to 5 points after getting every election right prior, and in 2020 getting it on the dot in terms of margin, we found that that poll was wildly inaccurate as well. It fed this false narrative that the Midwestern region was somehow shifting in a way that the Sun Belt was not. We read the tea leaves in states like Florida and Texas. That's why we moved it back and forth between lean and likely. Florida at one point I had as a lean state. By Election Day, we knew it would be likely and on the upper end of the likely column. We knew North Carolina and Arizona would move over to the Republican column despite Democrats swearing up and down that they were in a position where they were going to win those states. Georgia was a state where I very much felt like the turnout numbers that we were seeing being reported on by both sides of the aisle were misleading in favor of Kamala Harris because they overestimated the amount of support that we would see from the rural regions for Kamala Harris, that there were somehow going to be shifts and that those were turning out were Democrats that had not voted in previous elections because they were in vote sync areas. I guess the idea here was that there were areas in which many Democratic voters were surrounded by Trump country, thinking about Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, and were turning out, and the Atlanta metro area was shifting left. And to be fair, and to that point, Georgia actually saw a lot of their rural shifts being counteracted by Atlanta. That's why Donald Trump, in terms of winning Georgia, only won the state by roughly 2 points. It's significantly less than 2016, where he won by over 5 points, and just about 2 points worse than what it was in 2020. Given the national shift, again, the time and investment from Kamala Harris clearly could have resulted in a victory in a future election, but not in this one where Donald Trump won by 2 points. And just looking, again, across the board, Donald Trump had a clean sweep that was pushed. And when it comes down to the margin at which Donald Trump won this election by, back in 2016, it was less than this. But this cycle, 250,000 votes out of 140 million cast. You heard that correctly. 250,000 votes. And where do they come from? Let's take a look. Wisconsin, we see a divide here. Roughly 30,000 votes make the difference. In Michigan, you're seeing similar numbers here. Michigan, Wisconsin combined, about 110,000 votes separate the candidates there. Throw in Pennsylvania, you have about 100 more thousand that separate the candidates. Point being, across these states, you are finding that Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, the real division between the two was those 250,000 voters that actually might end up decreasing because Kamala Harris's numbers are getting slightly better in Michigan. They're getting slightly better in Pennsylvania as we count those remaining mail-in ballots. Wisconsin's going to stay the same. Roughly 200 to 250,000 votes separated the two candidates. That's really, really, really difficult. Really difficult for the Democratic campaign because it means that they actually were within reach of victory had this gone differently, had 150,000 people of that 250,000 voted against Donald Trump rather than for him, it could have been a much better map here. And so I really believe at its core that this election was a toss-up, that Donald Trump won those undecideds, and my map was wrong because I couldn't capture that, because I couldn't come into this. And I put too much merit in these high-quality pollsters that, again, had been right for a very long time until they were wrong. Just like in 2020, we had 17 bellwether counties in 2020. Bellwether counties that I was tracking. Think Vigo County, Indiana. If you remember my election live stream the day before, I talked about some of these bellwether counties back in 2020 because I did believe at the time, because they had been right for decades, I mean literally decades, that they would be the early signs and indicators. But then Donald Trump won 16 out of the 17 bellwether counties, and Joe Biden won the election. And it left just one. The election prediction and the final map that we were working with here was guided by similar numbers, by similar beliefs that, hey, American politics, while it is unpredictable, has some levels of predictability based on these very reputable sources that I trusted way too much and predicted a map that was incorrect. And in that final week, again, from that 2-week period where I had Trump winning, then I had Harris winning, then I had Harris winning on election day, it is always so difficult to tell what is noise versus what is making a difference. Noise, or a difference across the board. It's very difficult to adjust, and I felt like the safest bet and the reasonable conclusion to make, in that the media stories were turning up and negative things were coming out around Donald Trump. We were seeing reputable sources like Univision, which has been the voice of authority on the Latino vote across the nation, completely wiped out in terms of accuracy this cycle. We see that in real exit polling data of those who actually voted on election day, that Kamala Harris lost massive support amongst different demographic groups that, again, voices of authority, APIA vote, which is the voice of authority on Asian American voters across the nation, Asian Pacific Islander American vote, that is a reputable organization that does real polling for the Asian American community, that found that Kamala Harris was expanding Biden's margin by 15 points. They had nailed the elections prior. They did not nail this one. We saw a number of youth polls across the nation, very reputable ones that had nailed the margins before, missed this one. And while the polls at large had gotten the swing states correctly, on the oversamples by reputable sources that had previously gotten everything right on this, even in elections that Donald Trump won or lost, that had been able to capture that in, this time something was off. Unless we are seeing some massive realignment, which we possibly are, or maybe not even unless, if we are seeing this massive realignment, the way at which the polling companies on the wide demographic spreads needs to change, and not necessarily on the statewide lens. It was different than in 2016 and 2020, where the predictive factors were, in fact, some of these state-level district polls. We saw in 2016 and in 2020, those district-level polls were indicators that either Trump would win or Trump would lose, that these high-level oversamples of young Americans, of Black voters, Hispanic voters, Asian American voters, all across the board, those were indicators in 16 and 20 that were not indicators this time. And so we're starting to see this swap of what is real and substantial for an election versus not. And I don't want to move forward in any future election until we start to see, and I imagine that many of these firms will announce the way that they approach the election and the predictions and the polls differently, just as they did in 16 and 20, that ended up with, quite frankly, accurate enough swing state polling numbers. While the margins might have shifted enough that Donald Trump was able to win all of these states, he was predicted to win the majority of them. And that's very different than any previous election cycle. And so I really do apologize for my electoral map being inaccurate. I do think that a lot of the blame ultimately falls on me. I was building out this electoral map trying to use the experience that I had in predicting previous elections in covering this election from practically 2021, arguably. That's really when this presidential race started, Donald Trump announcing in 2022. But I was wrong. No matter how much we can try to say that, certain levels of this were right, certain levels were wrong, this was wrong. I am proud of my Senate map, which was off by just one state, seemingly Pennsylvania, unless that one still comes in for Democrats. That one could be right. It's off by one state. My governor's map was right, but those races were not too difficult to predict. This race was very difficult to predict, and I went the entirely opposite direction. I think moving forward, we need to keep things in mind. That Donald Trump, no matter how much the polls say he's up or down, he is being overestimated. The thing here is that there won't be any future elections where Donald Trump himself will be on the ballot unless we repeal an amendment, which I don't think is going to happen. There won't be any elections in which Donald Trump himself is on the ballot. In future midterms and future special elections, we will see. We will see whether or not there is this belief that even if Donald Trump is on the ballot, or not belief, but this urge to vote from a lot of these voters that may have voted for the first time in this election, may have switched their vote from Democrats for decades to Donald Trump in this election. There are a lot of voters out there that were Clinton 2016, Biden 2020, and Trump 2024. And the question is, arguably for Democrats too, how do you win them back? And what does this mean for future elections? Now, you have every right to be upset with me. You have every right to be upset with me. I fully understand that this map here, and in a way, some of you guys find me as this voice of authority on elections. I've been covering elections since 2017, and I would like to be right more than I would like to be wrong. But this map here clearly was misguided, and I will try my hardest moving forward to ensure that we are not in a position where we are doing things wrong again. In 22, I learned my lesson when it came down to some of those Senate races. I got backlash from you guys then, and it wasn't too far off, right? It was talking about Dr. Oz would win in Pennsylvania, but Democrats would roughly fare well elsewhere. This time, I was predicting a presidential election wrong, and you have right to be upset with me and be angry with me. But please, please, please understand me when I say this is going to be a learning moment for a lot of people across the country. Whether it's on the high level, as in the Democratic Party might genuinely see a massive restructuring into how they approach electoral politics, or down to people like me who create videos talking about elections. Because this election threw a lot of people for a loop. Although many conservative media outlets did believe Donald Trump would win the election, the extent at which the win would be by was also unpredictable. 312 to 226. It's something to think about. And it's also something to think about a reality in which Joe Biden had remained on the ballot. Because I honestly think I would be in a different position, looking at that election. And I do think I would have predicted the electoral map that we're going to see, 312 to 226, as I did when Biden dropped out of the race. But it actually might have been even bigger than that. And we can talk about that in a future video. But I genuinely want to thank you guys for bearing with me throughout this entire election season. You guys are the reason I do things like this, and I totally understand when I let you guys down, and I want to apologize for that. At the end of the day, these videos are for you to understand the election in a way that is not misleading, is not trying to confuse you or misguide you into who's going to win or how they're going to win or what they are going to win by. And so moving forward, keeping all of this in mind, we'll make progress, we'll make improvements, and we'll come back together with a more accurate predictive model. We'll come back together with better data points and a realignment of what in the data analytics world and political punditry world, what matters to predictions and what does not matter to predictions, what matters in forecasting and what matters to these models. A lot of this is going to change in the era of a second Trump presidency. We might return to a day and age where we do not have Donald Trump effect on the ballot because we didn't in any midterms, but we did in every election he ran in. But for Democrats, he can't run in any election again, or Republicans, he can't run in any election again. This is going to be the last cycle with Donald Trump on the ballot, and we are going to see it, and we are going to watch it, and we are going to learn from it, because there is a lot to learn from this model here and my model that predicted a forecast with 292 electoral votes for Kamala Harris when she performed far worse than 292. And so we need to keep that in mind and move forward in a way that we can completely change the way we understand elections for the positive and for all of you guys to get a better understanding of the American electorate from me and from many other people across the internet. So again, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down any future suggestions down below. I'm really interested to see what you guys want to see covered post-2024 election. We're going to do a lot of autopsy videos. We're going to talk a lot about what went right for Republicans, what went wrong for Democrats. We're going to cover all these remaining election results. We're going to cover the final stages of the Nevada Senate race. We're going to cover the final stages of the Pennsylvania Senate race. We're going to cover it all. We're going to cover the Trump presidency. We are going to cover all of these different things because that's what we're here for. It doesn't just end in the presidential election. And so again, I thank you guys so much for staying along with me on this journey, and I would love to see you guys all in another video.